and the Republican side of the aisle to acknowledge the mathematical problem.
I know you're reading your talking points. When I interview, hang on, I'm going to answer your question. When I interview,
I think they had ideas, but they were bad ideas. They were bad ideas for America.
Senator, we're a little off topic. I have to let Senator Obama respond to that
because that just
I'll
doesn't.
tell you what the facts are.
Rick, again.
You had the
Rick,
word.
I'm speaking.
I'm
speaking.
The newspaper.
I'm speaking.
Welcome to the live special edition of UCTV Politics. I'm Cameron Wilcox, here with our debaters. Tonight's topic is gun control. Representing the Democratic side is Kevin Alvarez, and representing the Republican side is Chris Connelly. So let's get started with the opening statements. We'll first start off with Chris.
Thank you, Cameron. I would like to thank UCTV for having me tonight. Today, our nation lives in a society where we believe that gun control is equal to crime control. Now, Obama has set out numerous executive orders in the past couple of weeks trying to unveil a new plan to reduce gun violence across the United States. Now, this will simply not work due to the fact of what I said earlier, that gun control does not equal crime control, and I will get into details of that later.
Kevin?
Thank you, Cameron, and thank you to Chris and for UCTV for having us here. The issue really is not just gun control, it's gun violence. And the United States has a particular problem with gun violence. We have the highest rate of it in anywhere in the developed world, and that's simply not acceptable. And what the Democratic Party, led by President Obama, is trying to do is trying to address some of these problems instead of just saying stuff happens. These issues have a wide array of ways to address them, and we haven't, over the past decade, been doing that, both because of obstructionism with Republicans and also because we haven't articulated exactly how we're going to go about this in a comprehensive manner. So for the United States, one of the biggest things we need to address right now is the epidemic of gun violence we're facing, and I believe we're going to discuss some ways to do that tonight.
Well, just as was mentioned earlier, President Obama unveiled a new plan to reduce gun violence across the United States. The plan included provisions such as expanding background checks, licensing requirements, and the hiring of 200 new ATF agents to enforce regulations. The overall plan is set to cost over $500 million and was described by President Obama as being necessary to prevent future gun violence. Do you support the provisions proposed in President Obama's plans? What changes would you institute, if any, to the current proposal?
First, I strongly agree with this plan. The way that it works is that it's clarifying things in existing law, particularly concerning background checks, so that it's easier to enforce them. It includes provisions that make reporting to law enforcement agencies much more streamlined. It makes, and $500 million is what it's expected to cost, but that's actually an investment into mental health services as well. It's President Obama taking a multifaceted approach to address gun violence from the executive branch, which is what he can do lawfully. What we need to do is introduce new laws that are more comprehensive, because the executive can only do so much. And what President Obama is doing here is a great deal and moving the country forward in a better direction, but he cannot do it alone, and Congress needs to act to really address this problem in a better manner.
Chris, your response?
Well, as the executive just started to get at, we don't need to start adding more laws to this situation. We need to refine the laws that we already have. As you were saying, Obama does plan to to refine the plans that we already have in place and to fix everything that is going on. But the fact is that what we have right now is not working.
I would agree that what we have right now is not working, but it's not working because of Democratic policies to try to restrict gun ownership. It's not working because Republicans and the NRA seem uninterested in dealing with any of the problems concerning gun violence. They're in favor of laws that allow people to carry a gun into a bar, even though that's significantly more likely to cause incidents of gun violence. And so I would say to that yes, what we're doing isn't working, but we need to be introducing new laws and better laws to deal with it.
So, as a lot of people propose to arguments behind these plans is they compare our country to a lot of other countries, one being Great Britain, which has an increased amount of gun control in their nation. Just in 2010, Derek Byrd actually committed a mass shooting, which is one of the biggest concerns about the gun violence in our nation, which killed 12 people with a shotgun and a bolt-action rifle. Now,
21 of which have occurred, or there have been 21 thus far in 2016 mass shootings in the United States. But the prior year was 330. So the idea of
besides the fact, the point I was trying to get to was the fact that if you compare our legislation to other countries, for example, Russia Russia has 10 times the amount less of guns within their nation, but have 10 times more, more murder rates compared to Germany, who has less gun control.
Yes, but Russia isn't included in the civilized, industrialized world in the same way that most Western countries are. Australia would be a great comparison with the United States, where they had a significant buyback program, which reduced their gun violence by roughly 67%.
Thank you, gentlemen, but we do have to move on to our second question. This one will be for you, Chris. The issues of gun control and gun violence are centered on the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, which states that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This amendment, though increasingly controversial, has been upheld in recent years by the United States Supreme Court. The most recent decision by the court in 2008 struck down several Washington, D.C. laws banning handguns. Do you think the Second Amendment is still a necessary part of our Constitution? Should any changes be made concerning the interpretation of this amendment as it stands today?
Well, no, there should not be any change to the interpretation of the Second Amendment as there is today. It's there as a fact, not as an interpretation. It's there said in the Constitution that we have the right to bear arms. Now, what has been going on in our country there's been plans to try to increase gun control, like you said, with increased background checks, increase gun safety through the ATF and such. But the problem is the fact that the system that we already have in place, such as background checks, is already flawed as it is. Instead of increasing more laws, we need to focus on the system we already have and refine it, but also we need to start looking at what the actual problem is. The liberal filmmaker Michael Moore actually admitted that his film Bowling for Columbine, in the end, was supposed to talk about how gun violence in this nation is a huge problem, which it is. But he was talking about the fact that he also agrees with the NRA that the gun control acts that we have put in our nation have not been working, because not only is it just about the guns, it's about the social fabric within our nation. It's about the people.
I would actually agree. The problem with guns isn't just guns. It's a cultural problem within the United States. Though one of my issues is that, sure, in that question, it was cited the right of the people to keep and bear arms, or that the people have that right. What wasn't mentioned is that the actual amendment reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Second Amendment is the only amendment that actually states its own intent within the amendment. So that whole first section of it seems to be ignored. And it's ignored because it's an inconvenient component to the fact that it's the only amendment that says you should be regulating this.
And a rebuttal from you?
Well, the simple fact is that for 100 years after that, we have been interpreting it a different way. We've been interpreting it towards our citizens, and we have allowed our country to evolve for a culture that needs to bear arms. We have the right to bear arms, not just because it's stated in the Constitution, but we have the God-given right to be able to do that. Now, the fact that, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Well, I would say I actually do agree the individual person, both by jurisprudence and by the nature of the law, do have the right to bear arms on an individual level. The quote, the right of the people, is a legal term that's used throughout the Constitution. So I'm not disputing that. What I'm disputing is this idea that we're going to talk about guns as something that we can't regulate. You can regulate any right people have. You regulate the First and the Fifth, and every amendment is regulated. And it's regulated to ensure the safety of all people within reason, without infringing on their true rights. The Second Amendment, the way that we talk about it and the way we treat it as something so inalienable that we can let people only have to take an 8-hour course to get a deadly weapon and then carry that deadly weapon wherever they so choose, is a cultural problem, and one that we need to address.
Well, we are only getting started here on tonight's debate. We'll be right back after this quick commercial break. And we're back. This first question will be for Kevin. Florida Representative Cliff Stearns recently introduced a new bill called the National Right to Carry Act, which would require states
to honor weapons permits issued by other states. In contrast, California Governor Jerry Brown enacted a law which prevents open carry of firearms entirely. These and many other contradictory laws concerning gun ownership in various states has led to discussion over who should regulate gun statutes, the states or the federal government. Which entity do you feel should have the power to regulate? How would you go about creating laws that conform to both loose and strict regulation states?
Well, I would say both have the power to regulate guns, but they have the power to regulate it in different ways. The federal government has an overarching, basically the unified quality to it, where it sets the standard by which all states must follow. For things like that, universal background checks being mandatory, and things of that nature should all go into the federal level, but on the state level, concealed carry permits should be a state issue. Because the individual state and the way they want to treat guns is up to them, and it depends on their culture and their cultural standard. What the federal government's role is to unify the culture around guns as a whole, which is that they are a part of our society, but they are a part that we need to respect, and we need to ensure the safety of all of our citizens in the context of guns and gun violence in this country.
Chris?
That's actually a lot of good points there. One of the biggest things I was going to say is the fact that having the fact to open carry actually helps create a safer society. An armed society is a safe society. The fact if you're on the street and someone comes up to you with a gun, who are they going to choose? Somebody else who is open and carrying, and someone that has another firearm, or are they going to attack someone who is either closed carry and they have no idea who's carrying a firearm? The fact of the matter is that open carrying will also lead to a safer society.
I strongly disagree with that based on the statistics that if you're assaulted, if you're a victim of assault, you're 4 times more likely to be killed if you have a gun than if you don't. If you're, with open carry permits, you have a society where 77% of more traffic incidents happen with people who are carrying guns with them, because it increases aggression towards other people and it leads them towards violence. Not because the people are inherently violent, but because a deadly weapon being carried openly in a society isn't a society at all. It's an anarchy.
Going back to that point, you're talking about how the society creates the fact that we're inherently violent. That's exactly the point. If we're open and carrying, you said talking about carrying firearms would make like the society seem. I lost my train of thought.
That's all right. I think one of the problems that we get into with these issues of particularly pertaining to open carry, it increases the amount of incidents where people have confrontations in a situation where they would not normally. I don't have the statistics on me for that, but having a deadly weapon increases the risk of using a deadly weapon, and no civilized society should want that injected into their social order. The idea that guns protect people is simply untrue. If you're a gun owner, you're significantly, particularly in the home, you're significantly more likely to be killed by a gun than anybody else. And so this standard that guns are there to help you, simply they don't. They make your life much more at risk than you would be otherwise.
On to the next question. One of the more controversial ideas to prevent gun violence is the presence of armed police officers at schools, and in some even armed and trained teachers. What do you feel is the best route to ensure safety in schools and prevent tragedies such as Columbine and Sandy Hook before they happen? Should individual school districts be allowed to decide how to handle this issue, or should state or federal lawmakers take the responsibility?
Well, as the point I was trying to make before, how an armed society is a safe society, having guards in school would increase the safety of the school. As you saw with the horrific tragedy of Sandy Hook, there was no armed forces within that school during that tragedy. If God forbid, if someone had a weapon in their desk and a weapon carried on them, something could have happened to be able to prevent the attack. I actually remember hearing that one of the assistant principals actually tried to go out in the hallway and make an attempt at stopping the situation, but she was unarmed at the point and was unable to do anything considering the guy had a weapon on him. To who is supposed to take this responsibility, I think it is the responsibility of the legislation to make suggestions to the people, but in the end, as long as the Second Amendment isn't affected and we're allowed to bear arms, I feel like it's on the society's level to be able to take a stance and actually make a move in this situation.
Thank you, Kevin.
I would also strongly disagree with that, because more guns should not be in our schools to protect our children from guns. In hospital shootings, 1 out of 5 of those takes place because the gun was taken from an armed guard. So it actually increases the risk that students are in danger when you have more guns in the school, particularly teachers especially who are untrained in combat, where only, I think, 3% of all mass shootings are stopped by somebody with a gun. It's simply impractical, and there's no evidence to ever suggest that it makes our children safer. Rather, it makes them more in trouble.
To be honest, I don't even understand what the reason is behind that point, because just because you're saying that being in the hospital and taking a gun off of an armed guard within the hospital could lead to a more dangerous situation. Someone could easily, take a gun off of somebody else, or even own a gun and walk right into the hospital and increase the danger of that situation. So I'm just honestly not understanding the point you're trying to make.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is that guns are frequently taken off of security personnel. If you have a gun on you, same with the statistic that I said before, a weapon on you is more likely to be used against you in an assault rather than anything else. So putting more guns in the hands of people who aren't trained to use them and expecting them to defend our children, or putting them in the hands of people trained to use them and not expecting that they can be taken or that those people can be overpowered, is simply just illogical, and it has never happened practically in the real world. What we need to make sure is people aren't walking into those schools with guns.
All right, we're going to take another quick break, but we'll be right back, so stay tuned.
Hey, you. Yeah, you. You look bored. You look like you need a homework break. Do you know what's going on at UConn? Do you want to be entertained? Then go to the UCTV channel 14 at youtube.com. youtube.com/the UCTV channel 14. You're welcome.
And we're back with our last question of the night, which will be for Kevin. Gun violence is an issue that almost all voters have stated must be addressed with a sense of urgency. However, there's not a consensus on what needs to be done. Some of the major anti-gun violence positions are increasing healthcare availability for the mentally ill, increasing civilian disarmament, and implementing purchasing restrictions such as waiting periods and background checks. What path do you believe would be the most effective at addressing the issue of gun violence in the United States?
Well, I actually don't think that there's a particular one answer to that question. The way that we deal with gun violence is multifaceted. Yes, you deal with things such as mental health, with background checks, making sure that criminals or people with criminal records can't purchase firearms. But you also deal with it on a cultural stage, on dealing with policing and targeted policing to areas that are hotspot areas. You deal with it with reducing access to alcohol, because people under the influence of alcohol typically commit more violence with guns. It's an issue that is systemic in our society, and you can't deal with it with one quick Band-Aid. You have to deal with it with a wide variety of things, and with everybody coming together and talking about those things. What we're dealing with now is a Republican Congress and party that isn't willing to engage on any of those topics. And so that's the real struggle that we have now.
Chris?
Talking about the social structure, there was an interview with Michael Moore I was talking about earlier from the Ed Show, where he was talking about the reasoning behind the issues and the stances we should take with this issue. Now, he believes that one of the biggest issues in America is not actually the gun control laws. He believes that gun violence is going to be created regardless due to the fact of the social structure in our nation. Now, the kids in Canada, they're playing the same violent video games that our kids are playing in our country, but what's the difference? The difference is that people in Canada have a social webbing to be able to fall back on. Poverty in this country is a big, huge issue that leads to criminals acting out, as you said earlier, and criminals, in the end, is the biggest problem.
Well, I agree. Criminals are the biggest problem with gun violence. Well, actually, no, never mind. I disagree with that. And here's why. Because, 2/3 of actual gun violence that takes place is the result of suicide, actually. So it's a gun in the home itself that is causing so many gun deaths. What we have is, in terms of gun violence and conflict, is criminals. And that is the problem, and it has to do with poverty, it has to do with systemic racism, it has to do with a whole range of issues, none of which are particular to gun violence, but all contribute to it.
One big point I want to make about that is when we're talking about gun violence. Suicide, obviously, is one of the biggest reasons can be caused by someone who can legally purchase a gun. I'm talking about criminals out in the black market during guns that are unregulated in our country that's entirely saturated. The problem with that is you can't, no matter how many regulations you put within trying to control firearms and semi-automatic weapons, is the fact that they're still going to exist in the country. There's still means of getting hands on them, and just because
I'm sorry, but that's untrue in the simple fact that there are countries all over Europe that is false, where they are nations that are attached to other nations that have high quantities of guns that they do not pass over. You have to regulate your...
But there's also a huge amount of countries that have a huge amount of gun control limits within the country, for example, Great Britain, but still have a huge amount of murder rates within their country.
Murder rates, but not gun violence rates. And so their rates of violence as a whole is significantly less. And so Great Britain's a good example of one where it's easier to regulate because they're an island nation. And same with Australia. But nations such as Finland, Denmark, Sweden, all of those are countries attached to other countries like Switzerland, where Switzerland has an enormous amount of guns, but they regulate them as such in their countries that it reduces the population that has them. So the gun issue as a whole is not the black market.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, but we do have to cut you off right there. Before we sign off for tonight, let's move on to the closing statements. Since Chris went first with the opening statements, Kevin, you will go first for closing statements.
Okay. Thank you. With guns and gun violence, we have to understand that the way we deal with it is multifaceted. You first have to respect the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding gun owners all over this country. And on top of that, you need to address the systemic problem in our culture and in our society that allows this gun violence to take place and allows for criminals to get their hands on guns. We don't seem to address in our country, to any significant fashion, the suicide rate or the danger of a gun in the home. We don't seem to address the fact that we have dealt with this problem for decades, and yet every time any bill comes up to do anything about it, it's filibustered. So the way that we deal with gun violence in this country is by addressing every factor that causes it, which is first on background checks, on making sure that criminals don't get their hands on them, but also dealing with societal problems and the violence in our society and the culture that adds to it. Guns are not the only problem, but they are a significant contributor to the violence and the dangers of our society.
Gun control as a whole, as you stated, is a multifaceted issue. But the problem is we as a nation has tried to attack it in many different ways. In 1994, the federal assault weapons ban did absolutely nothing, considering the fact that we didn't have an actual definition of what an assault weapon is. The fact of trying to add more policies and more differential advantages within our nation to try to control what is going on isn't going to work, because what's going on is not on a policy level, it is on a cultural level. And I'd like to thank UCTV for having me, and my opponent Kevin, and my moderator Cameron.
Well, that's all we have for tonight's UCTV Politics on gun control debate. I'm Cameron Wilcox. Thank you for watching. Good night, and God bless.